I'm Lena, welcome or welcome back to my channel, and yes, this year I am going to be a Victober host. 2025 will be the 10th year of Victober, meaning we have 10 hosts, including a bunch of co-hosts next to our regular host, and I am one of those co-hosts this year. If you're not sure what Victober is, it's very simple. Every October we read Victorian literature, meaning Irish or English literature published or written within the reign of Queen Victoria. I'm very honored to have been asked to also be a host this year. I've been participating for years, and Victober is such a wonderful month that I like to join every single year. This year though, because there are 10 hosts, there are also 10 challenges. I will tell you the challenges in a little bit, but first know that you're allowed to double up on these challenges, so you don't have to actually read 10 books. There are different tiers that you can reach if you do. Personally, I will try and do, of course. We'll get to that after the challenges. So first, I would like to mention all of the wonderful co-hosts this year. Of course, we have our hosts that we know and that we know that host Victober, which is Katie, Kate, Ross, and Marissa. We have Elizabeth from Elizabeth Literary Princess, Hannah from Hannah's Books, Jess from Dickens and Dogs, which is mostly a Bookspam account, but she does sometimes post things on YouTube, Roy from Roy Reads Anything, and Catherine from Taking Tea with Catherine. All of these hosts have their own challenges. At the end of this video, I will give a few recommendations for my challenge, and if you want recommendations for each specific challenge, all the channels I just mentioned are linked down below, and in their announcement videos they give recommendations for their own challenge. I would highly recommend looking at that because a lot of these people are so knowledgeable when it comes to Victorian literature and are able to recommend you books that you may not have heard of. Kate's challenge is to read a Victorian book where friendship is featured. Katie's challenge is the same as her very first challenge for the very first Victober. That is to read a work of Victorian literature that's not a novel, so short stories, plays, poetry, or even non-fiction. With the non-fiction, be sure that it's actually written in the Victorian era and it's not just about the Victorian era. Marissa's challenge is to read a piece of Victorian literature where a character experiences a change in class. Ross' challenge is the only challenge that's not necessarily a challenge that you can match to a book, but that you can use throughout your reading. And it's called Empire Spotting. Anytime you see the Empire discussed in your Victorian literature, make a note. Elizabeth's challenge is to read a work of Victorian literature by an underrated female author. Hannah's challenge is to read a Victorian work that discusses education. Jess' challenge is to step back in time and read a work of historical fiction, specifically set in a different era. I will keep my challenge to law. My challenge is challenge number 8, but challenge number 9 is Roy's challenge, and that is to read a work of Victorian fantasy. And challenge number 10, Catherine's challenge, is to read a Victorian book that has a connection to Jane Austen. My challenge is to spin a color wheel, whether digital or physical. I would guess digital. You can Google color wheel generator and you will find a digital color wheel. To spin that color wheel, and whatever color you land on needs to be the major color on the cover of a book. This is perfect to combine with any of the other challenges. You can start out when you make your TBR with the color wheel spin, and whenever you pick books for the other challenges, keep in mind that you want to match it with a certain color. Classics have a lot of different editions, and I'm not going to police whether you're actually reading the edition of the color you pick from. So this prompt does give a lot of freedom. At the end of this video, I will recommend some books that I really love and match them to a certain color. So if you are stuck on a color and can't find a Victorian book that you would like to read, that could be helpful. I know most people will use a digital color wheel, but because it's Victober and I'm dressed like a semi-Victorian modern lady, I also felt like how would a Victorian woman use this prompt? She would start crafting, or at least most of them would if they had the time. So I crafted from cardboard a wheel, painted it in different colors and hung it on the wall, which is also a fun way if you want to do some crafting. It's a really easy, quick craft. It's a bit more difficult to determine how to put it up against the wall, but that can be fun as well. I just used a screw and I used a screw hole that was already in the wall and I screwed it in. And then you can determine a color maybe a little bit more historically accurate. I had a lot of fun doing this. Would recommend, but you can very much use a digital color wheel if you want to. In my TBR video, I will pick my own color. I mentioned that there are tiers, and there very much are. There are 4 tiers that you can reach depending on how many prompts you fulfill. If you complete 1 or 2 prompts, you are a character from David Copperfield. You are Mr. Macabre level. I've not read David Copperfield, so I needed to look up this for a bit, but you know, it's very acceptable. If you complete 4 to 6 challenges, you are Jane Eyre level, which is, in my opinion, top tier, but it's the second one in this list. If you complete 7 to 9 prompts, you are Sherlock Holmes level. And if you complete 10 prompts, which is what I am going to do, or what I plan to do. Whether I will actually do it, who knows. You're Dracula because you need inhuman powers to make it happen, and I love overestimating myself. Having said that, all you need to do to join Victober is to read one piece of Victorian literature. So even if you just read one book, you have joined Victober. And let that book be Hester by Margaret Oliphant, because that is our group read this year. Margaret Oliphant is a new author for me, so I was very excited when we picked this one. It was between this one and Villette by Charlotte Brontes, which I read semi-recently and loved. It's one of my favorite books, but I wasn't quite ready for a reread. I'm very happy I get to read a new to me book. There's a reading schedule that you can follow. You don't have to, of course. I personally will, because we have a very active Discord where you can discuss anything and everything Victober. The Discord link will be in the description down below, and all you have to do is accept that link, and probably you'll have to make an account if I remember correctly, but Discord is very, very easy to join. We will be reading 2 chapters a day, starting on the 1st of October and ending on the 22nd of October. So if you like reading with others, then do follow the schedule, do read that book with us, and discuss all your thoughts in the Discord. We would love to have you there. Hester is a story of a relationship between 3 characters. We follow Catherine, who is a bit older. Catherine has a bit of a conflict with Hester, who has her eyes set on Edward, who's another favorite of Catherine's, but she very much does not approve of this match, as far as I can tell. Catherine is supposed to be this matriarch whom everyone listens to, except for Edward and Hester. It does kind of sound like Lady Catherine de Bourgh from Jane Austen, so maybe that's a connection you could make for the prompt. Tagline on the bag really spoke to me. It says, Hester is a masterpiece of psychological realism. In exploring the difficulty of understanding human nature, it's also a compulsive story of financial and sexual risk-taking that inevitably results in a searing climax. That sounds very intense, and I'm very excited to discuss it with all of you. For the color wheel prompt, there are not really any specific recommendations. For the color wheel prompt, you can use anything and everything, of course. Novel, short story, plays, as long as it is a physical book that has a color on the cover. Personally, I'm going to be reading a lot of ebooks from Gutenberg, so you can just look up what the physical edition looks like. It does need to have a physical edition with a color on it. I guess that is the only really rule I have for this prompt. Then something I would recommend looking at are certain editions that feature such prominent colors that you don't really have to wonder whether or not it is a main color. So I would personally recommend looking at the Penguin Clothbound, at the Penguin English Library, but also at the new Wordsworth editions, which are incredibly colorful. So for every color, I will recommend 2 or 3 books that I really love that feature in these editions on a certain color. Let's start with yellow. I'm going to recommend Far From Men and Crow by Thomas Hardy. If you're a more seasoned Victorian reader, I'm sure you've already read this. If this one has been sitting on your TBR, then this is your push if you spin yellow. Far From Men and Crow is the story of Bathsheba Everdeen, who inherits a farm and has very complicated romantic entanglements with 3 different men. It is, in my opinion, Hardy's best novel. Mary and I have been doing the Thomas Hardy really long, and both of us find that this is our favorite. For me, it was a reread. For Mary, it was her first read, and it's also her favorite. Although we're not sure compared to Tess from Tess of the D'Urbervilles, but neither of us is really ready to reread that one. But Far From the Men and Crowd is a great book, especially if you're reading a bunch of Victorian classics. This book has a bit more plot and intrigue than a general Victorian book, so it would be a much faster read than some others. Another yellow book is a book that I've not actually read myself, but I think I might read it this Victober. The Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seagull in Many Lands by Mary Seagull. This is a non-fiction, so again easy to match up to any of the other prompts, of a Jamaican-born nurse who traveled to many places to work, mostly I believe as a war nurse. She was very tightly connected to Florence Nightingale as well, and I've heard nothing but intriguing things from people who actually read this book. Heading over to orange, which is a bit more of a difficult color for Victorian literature. The Wordsworth edition of Black Beauty has a lot of orange features, and Black Beauty is my favorite Victorian children's book, I can easily say. I love Black Beauty. It is heartbreaking, clever, and very easy to read. It's definitely one of the most easiest Victorian novels I've ever read. It is from the perspective of a horse who goes through the motions of Victorian London and a little bit outside of London as well. But we see very much the harsh conditions that are created for the people that we see in like a Dickens or Elizabeth Gaskell novel. We see how that also reflects on a working horse. and I love this. The friendship, the love, it is heartbreaking, you might cry a little bit, but it's a beautiful novel. If you are looking for some Dickens and if you want to read a thick book, I would recommend For Orange, Our Mutual Friend. Personally, my favorite Charles Dickens. This is the kind of Charles Dickens book where the characters are really well developed and not necessarily caricatures, which some of the characters are in other Dickens books. Not that I mind that at all, to be honest. Our Mutual Friend is one of the most deep and most developed Charles Dickens novels. Going to green, which is a much easier color for Victorian literature, it turns out. My first recommendation would be the cloth-bound edition of Cranford, but just generally, Cranford is one of Elizabeth Gaskell's novels that doesn't necessarily feel like a novel. It feels like stories that are woven together, although it does have a main plot. But we follow a lot of mostly elderly ladies who live in the town of Cranford, where they don't want anything to change until a semi-stranger comes to town and things do start to change a bit. This is such a cozy and wonderful Elizabeth Gaskell novel. I generally think that Elizabeth Gaskell is strongest in short format, and this book is about 200 pages. By far my favorite longer work of Elizabeth Gaskell. My favorite of hers are her short stories, because I think she is just mind-blowingly good at writing short stories. But Cranford is so cozy and comforting that I would highly recommend it. If you want a bit of a different vibe, the Wordsworth edition of The Tenant of Whitehall is also completely green. The Tenant of Whitehall, again, if you're a more seasoned Victorian reader, I'm sure you've read it, but otherwise I would highly recommend it. It doesn't always get mentioned as often as Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, but this is Anne Bronte's main novel that is about a woman who gets entangled into a marriage that first is from a place of passion, but then turns out to be very abusive, and we follow her as she makes her way through an independent life, and it's beautifully written and very realistic. It's not as gothic and romantic as the other Bronte novels. It's more centered in realism, and I really appreciated it for that. If Thomas Hardy is on your TBR, I would recommend looking at the new Wordsworth covers, who all have a lot of green in them. So you can match this basically to any Thomas Hardy novel if you spin green. If you want something completely different, if you're looking for some sci-fi, I would recommend The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. This is not without its issues, so be aware, but this is about a man who builds a time machine and then goes through a time where things are very different, and he tries to make sense of what he sees, and he also tries to control what he sees. I found it very interesting. It's very short, but if you're looking for something a little bit different genre-wise when you're Victober reading, it's a great one to give a go. For pink, I'm gonna recommend two more feminist things. Christina Rossetti's poems, which are wonderful. I've only read The Goblin Market, but found that fascinating, so beautifully written. Again, I don't think without its issues, but that's also something interesting to explore. I'm just going to recommend Jane Eyre real quick. If you're new to Victorian literature, read Jane Eyre. It's a great place to start. For purple, I'm going to recommend Silas Marner by George Eliot. This is about a man who finds a young girl that needs, a parent, someone to take care of her. That is very simply said. There's also a bit of a mystery in this book, which I really loved. It is a short George Eliot. It's not necessarily her best one, but I do think it's not mentioned enough for the amount of wonderful things that it does contain. Again, if you're new to George Eliot and want to dip your toes in the water, I mean, I would still kind of recommend The Mill on the Floss, which works for blue, by the way, but Silas Marner is great if you spin purple. The same goes for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is a short book, also has a purple cover, and it's great if you want to combine Victober with the spooky season. Like I mentioned, for blue I would recommend The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. This is a beautiful coming of age story that both discusses family relations and friendships. The main character in The Mill on the Floss is a bit divided, but I found her very interesting, and her faults for me were very connected to her age, but it might need a little bit of patience if you read this one. If you want to read something other than a novel and you spin blue, I would recommend The Fairy Tales by Oscar Wilde. These are really lovely and quite fantastical, but not too much. These are stories that Oscar Wilde told to his children, or he wrote them for his children, and there is a beautiful blue cover you can read. Also, I have a book I just want to recommend, and the cover is multicolored, so this would basically work for any color you spin, so it's a bit of a cheat. But De Profundis by Oscar Wilde was a letter he wrote when he was in prison, and he was imprisoned because of sexual relations between men. He wrote that letter to his previous lover, whom he blames for most of the misery in his life. It's a beautiful, emotional and interesting letter. It would also work for some of the other prompts like non-fiction, but this is a bit of a cheat because it has so many different colors, but I would highly recommend it. And I think it's also not mentioned enough when we talk about Oscar Wilde's oeuvre, because we're all focused on his plays and his fiction, but this letter is such a masterpiece of work. Another blue book that I would highly recommend is Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. I would just generally recommend Elizabeth Gaskell, which I'm sure most of you have read a lot by her, but Wives and Daughters was her last book that unfortunately she wasn't able to finish, but to me, it didn't really bother me. Wives and Daughters is about two stepsisters manage their friendship, their life, their relationship between family. It's a really beautiful, silent novel. I think quality-wise for me it very much matches with how I feel about Elizabeth Gaskell's short stories, is that it's just a true masterpiece. And Elizabeth Gaskell I would recommend for read is Mary Barton, which was, if not her first, one of her first novels that she published. This has a very racy mystery, and to me this book felt like reading a very long play. A lot of the setting is in a house where a lot of characters come, and to me it felt like a play, and I found it so lively and wonderful because of that. A book that I read 1 or 2 Victobers ago on Katie's recommendations. I will have to say most of these books I'm mentioning I read because of Kate, or Katie, let's be honest. And that is The Old Women by George Kissing. This is about a group of women who are mostly middle class or lower class, and they all have different occupations trying to make their way through life without having to commit to marriage, and they all have different opinions on what marriage is and how much of a prison it really is. Some of them get proven wrong, some of them get proven right. It's really interesting, and I would highly recommend it if you spin read. So I believe that is everything you need to know for the announcement of Victober. Do check out all the other videos and get to know the other hosts. I am so incredibly excited for Victober. I'm so happy to dive in one of my favorite periods of time. I'm also going to watch documentaries, watch series. If you have any recommendations of Victorian set films or TV series, please leave it in a comment down below. I usually have to reserve them for my library because that's the only place I can find them. But I am going to make a list, reserve them all and just watch them. If you want some recommendations from me of those things, then let me know. I can make a video about that. Let's all dive into Victober together. I think we will have a wonderful time. Even if you don't have the time to do something with all of these prompts, I would love it if you would read a Victorian classic and share in the Discord or in a comment in a video what you thought of it. Let's connect and have a wonderful time and a wonderful Victober together. Recommendations for all the prompts are in the other host videos. I am heading over there now to watch all of those, so I hope to see you in their comment sections. Have a wonderful Victober. Doei! This water bottle isn't very Victorian of me. Neither is the hand waving. I would need a fan, to be honest. That's the only thing I didn't get on Vinted. A nice fan. All the other things I did get for Vinted. I'm surprised at how well my hair is behaving, to be honest.